Even before the United States became an independent nation, it seemed to instinctively want to expand west. One reason why it declared independence in the first place was because its settlers were not allowed to expand west by their king. When they replaced their king with a president, America could now manifest its destiny of stretching from sea to shining sea. However, it would require cash, ink, and blood to do so. Part 1. Pushing the Boundaries. In the early 1800s, President Thomas Jefferson wanted the country to be full of small, independent farmers. These farmers needed the Mississippi River to ship their goods, and this made the port of New Orleans, at the mouth of the river, crucial for trade. But New Orleans belonged to Spain, and Spain could cut off American access at any time. In Europe, Napoleon Bonaparte took power in France in 1799. He wanted to bring back France's North American Empire, which it lost to Britain in 1763, and planned to use Spain's vast Louisiana territory to support French sugar plantations in the Caribbean. In 1800, Spain secretly gave this huge area to France to keep Napoleon happy. But problems quickly arose. A slave revolt in Haiti weakened France's hold in the Caribbean, and the imminent risk of war with Britain made Louisiana seem like more trouble than it was worth. In 1803, Jefferson, worried about losing access to New Orleans, sent diplomats to buy the city. But Napoleon, realizing that he did not need Louisiana anymore, offered to sell the entire territory for $15 million. Jefferson eagerly agreed. The Louisiana Purchase doubled the size of the United States, adding 828,000 square miles of land, from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains. Now, Jefferson's vision of a country filled with independent farmers could flourish. Not everyone agreed with Thomas Jefferson's vision for America. The Federalists, a major political party in New England, feared that the new land in the West could reduce New England's power by drawing away its citizens. Jefferson's vice president, Aaron Burr, tried to use these fears to split parts of New York and New England from the U.S. Burr planned to be elected governor of New York, who would then join it with New England and break away. When the election failed, he challenged his Federalist rival, Alexander Hamilton, to a duel. Burr killed Hamilton on July 11, 1804, and fled. Later, Burr went to the west and plotted to form a new nation in the Louisiana Territory and Mexico, with some military and Spanish allies. But his partner, General James Wilkinson, betrayed him. Burr was arrested for treason in 1806, but was acquitted. The Burr conspiracy showed America's weak power over the new lands, but in time, the new lands would strengthen the government. Much of the Louisiana Territory was unexplored, however. In 1804, Jefferson sent Meriwether Lewis and William Clark on a mission to explore the West. Their task was to map the land, learn about local indigenous cultures, and record scientific details about the region. For 2 years, they and their team traveled up the Missouri River, crossed the Rocky Mountains, and followed the Columbia River to reach the Pacific. They showed that a hypothetical water route to Asia, the Northwest Passage, did not exist in the region, but they did share important knowledge about the land. After the expedition headed back home, one member, John Colter, stayed in the West. He explored Wyoming, including places like Yellowstone and the Grand Tetons on his own in 1807 and 1808. Coulter's adventures became known only through word of mouth, not through detailed maps or records like Lewis and Clark's. Other explorers, such as Zebulon Pike, attempted to map more of the West. Pike's 1806 journey to the Red River gave the Great Plains the mistaken image of a desert, as farming technology at the time could not make the land productive. Nonetheless, these expeditions opened paths of settlement and exploration for Americans to use in the future, such as the Oregon Trail. Though the U.S. bought the Louisiana Territory in 1803, East and West Florida stayed with Spain. Spain's control of areas like Mobile Bay slowed economic growth in nearby territories like Mississippi and Alabama, who could not use the waterways to ship products. Florida also became a refuge for escaped slaves and Native Americans fleeing American mistreatment. Jefferson tried to take Florida through secret talks but failed. In 1810, President James Madison seized West Florida, claiming the land as part of the Louisiana Purchase. Later, President James Monroe pushed to take all of Florida, and ordered General Andrew Jackson to invade the Seminoles in the area. In March 1818, Jackson led the U.S. troops into Florida, beginning the First Seminole War. He targeted Spanish forts and native Seminole villages, blaming British traders for local resistance. Although he was only supposed to confront the Seminoles, unclear orders allowed him to go further. He occupied parts of Florida, adding pressure on Spain, which could not defend the region. In April, Jackson executed 2 British citizens. Britain, focused on maintaining trade, avoided enlarging the conflict. In October, the Treaty of 1818 set a border between the U.S. and British territories at the 49th parallel. In 1819, Spain signed the Adams-Onis Treaty, giving Florida to the U.S., and setting a border along the 42nd parallel. The Seminoles, however, were forced deeper into Florida's swampy interior. When Jackson became president in 1829, he wanted to remove indigenous nations from the U.S. to make room for white settlers. He especially targeted the 5 civilized tribes in the southeast: the Cherokee, Creek, Chickasaw, Choctaw, and Seminole. In 1828, gold was discovered in Cherokee land in Georgia, causing many settlers to trespass into their territory. Jackson used this to push the Indian Removal Act, which Congress approved on May 29, 1830, after much debate. The Choctaw were the first to go. They were forced to sign the Treaty of Dancing Rabbit Creek in September, giving up nearly all their land in Mississippi. They faced a deadly winter journey to the Indian Territory in present-day Oklahoma, where the U.S. government had set aside land for the tribes. The Cherokee went to court to defend their land. Though Chief Justice John Marshall was sympathetic to the Cherokee, he ruled that they were a domestic dependent nation, and not fully sovereign. The Cherokee cause was later reinforced in a later case, Worcester v. Georgia, seeing the Supreme Court rule Georgia had no right to control Cherokee land, but Jackson ignored this ruling. In 1835, some Cherokee leaders, pressured and desperate, signed the Treaty of New Etruria, giving up their land. In 1838, the Army forced most Cherokee west to Oklahoma on the Trail of Tears, where thousands of men, women, children, and their slaves died from cold, hunger, and lack of aid. The Creek and Chickasaw also faced violent eviction, and many Creeks were cheated out of their land. The Seminole, however, resisted through brutal guerrilla warfare, fighting alongside escaped slaves. Eventually, they too were defeated and relocated after a 6-year war. By the 1840s, over 50,000 indigenous people were forcibly removed to land they did not know, with more than 10,000 dying along the way. Part 2. To overspread and to possess. Despite the Louisiana Purchase, some Americans wanted more land. They looked to Texas, which was then a Mexican province. Many Americans, called filibusters, entered Texas illegally with small armies, hoping to make it part of the U.S. To defend against native attacks and control American expansion, Mexico allowed Americans to settle in Texas, but required them to follow Mexican laws, adopt Catholicism, and be loyal to Mexico. Moses Austin and his son Stephen F. Austin eventually led over 1,100 American families to settle in Texas. By 1830, Americans in Texas outnumbered Mexicans 2-1. Most settlers kept their American identity and did not follow Mexico's laws. When Mexico banned more American immigration and outlawed slavery, many American settlers were slaveholders, tensions rose. Despite the restrictions, settlers kept coming, and by 1835, about 30,000 Americans were in Texas. These settlers disliked Mexican control and wanted Texas to allow slavery. Political instability in Mexico made things worse. When Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna became dictator in Mexico, American settlers were angered. Stephen F. Austin, who first wanted a peaceful solution, began to support Texan independence as conflicts grew. In 1835, Texas declared independence, leading to a short war with Mexico. Santa Anna led a Mexican army to victory at the Alamo and ordered the execution of Texan prisoners at Goliad. However, under Sam Houston's leadership, the Texans rallied and defeated Santa Anna at the Battle of San Jacinto, capturing him and forcing him to sign a treaty recognizing Texas's independence. Though Texans wanted to join the U.S., America hesitated due to concerns about the balance of slavery in the country. Texas stayed independent until 1845, when it joined the U.S., despite ongoing tensions over slavery. Some Americans also started to look towards the Oregon Territory, which was jointly controlled by the United States and Britain. In 1792, American fur trader Robert Gray became the first European to sail into the Columbia River, while British officer George Vancouver mapped the area, including Puget Sound. After the U.S. bought Louisiana in 1803, Americans explored more, claiming Oregon through continuity. Since it was closer to America, it was American by principle. Britain, however, based its claim on Vancouver's maps and its trading posts along the Columbia River. After the Treaty of 1818, both sides agreed to share Oregon. By the 1840s, thousands of American settlers traveled the Oregon Trail to settle in the fertile Willamette Valley south of the Columbia River, bringing diseases that weakened native communities. Some settlers like missionary Marcus Whitman, believed native resistance meant they lost their right to the land. Tensions grew, and in 1847, anger and illness led the Cayuse people to attack and massacre Whitman's mission. By then, Oregon was moving closer to full American control, and the massacre only convinced Congress to quickly organize the region into a territory. The annexation of Texas and the settlement of Oregon coincided with a growing movement of expansionism among the Americans. These expansionists argued that it was only inevitable that the United States was going to own not only Texas and Oregon, but also Canada, Mexico, and the rest of the North American continent. The American claim, wrote New Yorker newspaperman John O'Sullivan, is by the right of our manifest destiny to overspread and to possess the whole of the continent which Providence has given us for the development of the great experiment of liberty and federated self-government entrusted to us. It is in our future, far more than in our past, or in the past history of Spanish exploration or French colonial rights, that our true title is to be found. James K. Polk, elected in 1844, strongly believed in manifest destiny. After Congress approved the annexation of Texas in early 1845, Polk set his sights on Oregon. He wanted to expand the U.S. border with Canada up to 54 degrees 40 minutes, the southern boundary of Russian Alaska. However, some Democrats feared this would strain relations with Britain. While many Americans called for 54-40 or fight, demanding all of Oregon, Polk settled for a compromise at the 49th parallel to avoid conflict, as he was already embroiled in another one towards the south. The Senate approved the treaty in 1846, adding all of Oregon up to the 49th parallel, except for Vancouver Island, to U.S. territory. The Mexican War, Part 1. American Blood upon the American Soil. When the U.S. took over Texas, it sparked a crisis with Mexico. Though the treaty signed by Santa Anna said Texas was independent, Santa Anna only signed the treaty under pressure to get his release. Mexico never recognized the treaty or Texas's independence. Mexico believed the Texas border was along the Nueces River, not the Rio Grande, which President Polk claimed it was. To reinforce his claim, Polk sent American troops into the disputed territory in early 1846. In 1845, Captain John C. Fremont was exploring the Red and Arkansas rivers. As war seemed likely, he moved west, crossing the Rocky Mountains and Nevada Desert, arriving in California. After Mexican authorities ordered him to leave, Fremont moved into Oregon, massacring native tribes along his way. In Oregon, in May 1846, Fremont got orders from Polk to seize California. In June, Fremont and 800 American settlers captured Somona, raising a bear flag for their new revolt. Shortly after, U.S. Navy forces seized towns like Monterey and Yerba Buena, now San Francisco. By July 9th, the Bear flaggers lowered the flag and raised the U.S. flag in Sonoma. In early 1846, President Polk ordered General Old Rough and Ready Zachary Taylor to take U.S. troops to the Rio Grande, claiming it as Texas's border with Mexico. Polk hoped this show of force would make Mexico back down. Taylor built Fort Texas near the Mexican town of Matamoros, which alarmed Mexican commander Pedro de Ampudia. Ampudia warned Taylor to leave, but Taylor stayed and blocked the river, stopping Ampudia's supplies. This led Mexican President Mariano Paredes, under public pressure, to say that the U.S. had started a war. On April 25th, about 1,600 Mexican cavalrymen crossed the river and attacked Captain Seth Thornton's small patrol. In Washington, Polk heard about the battle and argued that Mexico has passed the boundary of the United States, has invaded our territory, and shed American blood upon the American soil. War exists, and, notwithstanding all our efforts to avoid it, exists by the act of Mexico herself. After debates in Congress, the Senate passed a war bill, and on May 13, 1846, Polk officially declared war on Mexico. Two weeks earlier, Taylor moved most of his troops from Fort Texas to guard supplies at Port Isabel, leaving a small group behind. General Mariano Arista aimed to surround Taylor's forces, but delays kept him from catching the Americans before they left. On May 3rd, Arista attacked Fort Texas and blocked Taylor's return. After securing Port Isabel, Taylor marched back with 2,300 soldiers. On May 8th, his army met Arista's 3,200 troops at Palo Alto. Both armies exchanged artillery fire, but the U.S. cannons caused heavier losses for the Mexicans. Arista tried several cavalry attacks, but U.S. soldiers held their ground. By nightfall, neither side had broken through, though Arista's troops suffered more. The next day, Arista took a better position behind a dry riverbed with thick brush. Taylor's forces attacked, combining infantry, cavalry, and artillery. After intense fighting, Taylor's men crossed the riverbed and forced Arista's troops to retreat. Many Mexican soldiers fled across the Rio Grande, leaving the supplies behind. Taylor relieved Fort Texas, and on May 18th, crossed the Rio Grande and took Matamoros as Mexican forces withdrew. General Taylor's lax rules on uniforms and discipline made him popular with his troops, but this approach led to poor hygiene. As American soldiers were marching across the Rio Grande, they became sick with diseases like dysentery. "I have seen more suffering since I came out here than I could have imagined to exist. It is really awful," wrote Lieutenant General George McClellan. "They literally die like dogs." Taylor's main target was Monterrey, the capital of Nuevo Leon. With limited supplies and slow progress, he reached Monterrey in late September with a mix of regulars and volunteers, some of whom were too sick to fight. Facing General Ampudia's 7,000 troops, Taylor's forces battled hard. After days of brutal combat in and around the city, Ampudia surrendered, and Taylor allowed Mexican troops and civilians to leave. Meanwhile, in California, Robert Stockton took over the U.S. Navy command. He gave Fremont control of U.S. land forces in California. Together, they joined forces with the Bear Flaggers and aimed to take the rest of the province. They acted fast, but used harsh tactics that upset many Californios, the local Spanish-speaking people who were used to their autonomy. On August 13th, Stockton captured Los Angeles. 4 days later, word of the official U.S. declaration of war arrived. Local Mexican leaders fled, and Stockton and Fremont thought California was secure. But by late September, the Californios had revolted and surrounded U.S. forces in Los Angeles, forcing them to surrender. Stockton returned with reinforcements and joined General Stephen Kearny, who had just arrived from New Mexico. In December, California Lances and American Sabres clashed at the Battle of San Pasqual, and overconfident Kearny was surrounded until Stockton rescued him and won the battle. After two more battles at the San Gabriel River and at La Mesa, the Americans re-entered Los Angeles. By January 1847, Fremont signed the Treaty of Cahuenga, giving Californios the same rights as U.S. citizens. When the Californios were first beginning their revolt, Kearny was busy leading an army to take New Mexico. In August 1846, he entered Santa Fe without a shot fired after Mexican Governor Manuel Armijo surrendered. After Kearny left for California, the Nuevo Mexicanos and the Pueblo people revolted, but Colonel Sterling Price defeated them in 1847, putting New Mexico under American control for the rest of the war. The Mexican War, Part 2. The Halls of Moctezuma. While the Mexican War was raging, Santa Anna was busy being exiled in Cuba. In 1846, President Polk secretly worked with Santa Anna, hoping he'd help end the war. Polk allowed Santa Anna back into Mexico, expecting him to negotiate peace. But Santa Anna betrayed him. Once in power, he rallied Mexican forces to keep fighting. When Congress learned of Polk's secret deal, many lost trust in Polk's leadership. Polk chose the commander of the entire U.S. Army, General Winfield Scott, to lead an invasion towards Mexico City to speed up the war. Scott's plan needed resources from Taylor, who was left with only 4,500 troops. Learning of his enemy's weakness, Santa Anna then led 20,000 soldiers north to attack Taylor's smaller force. On February 22, 1847, George Washington's birthday, both sides fought at Buena Vista. Though outnumbered, American soldiers, many of them new volunteers, fought hard, reinvigorated by the Founding Fathers' birthday. At one point, Mississippians led by Jefferson Davis stopped a Mexican advance that threatened to collapse the American line. By night, after heavy losses, Santa Anna's forces retreated, exhausted and short on supplies. This battle marked a major success for the U.S., securing American control of northern Mexico despite both sides suffering heavy casualties. With the North secure, Scott led the first major amphibious landing in U.S. military history. In early March, the U.S. Navy blocked the port of Veracruz, while Scott landed with 10,000 troops. Mexican General Juan Morales had only half that number, many of whom were untrained, so he relied on the city's formidable walls for defense. Scott decided to attack with heavy artillery from the Navy, bombarding the city for several days. The damage caused over 1,000 casualties, including many civilians. The terrified city surrendered on March 26th. Scott wanted to keep the peace by paying for supplies and respecting locals. He reopened the port, collected taxes, and protected Catholic churches. But as his army prepared to march inland, the first cases of yellow fever broke out, forcing a swift departure. As Scott marched towards Mexico City, Santa Anna repaired defenses at Cerro Gordo with 12,000 soldiers. ignoring his engineer's advice to set up artillery on a nearby hill called La Atalaya. Santa Anna believed the rugged terrain would prevent any surprise attacks. However, Captain Robert E. Lee discovered a hidden path through thick brush. On April 17th, Lee guided American troops to seize La Atalaya and set up artillery for an attack at dawn. The following morning, the Americans struck from both the front and rear, catching Santa Anna's forces off guard. The Mexican army quickly fled, leaving behind weapons, supplies, money, and even Santa Anna's artificial leg. Though Scott captured many Mexican soldiers, the Mexican people continued to resist. "What a stupid people they are," Captain Kirby Smith angrily fumed. "They can do nothing, and their continued defeat should convince them of it. They have lost 6 great battles. We have captured 680 cannon, nearly 100,000 stand of arms, made 20,000 prisoners, have the greatest portion of their country, and are fast advancing on their capital, which must soon be ours, if they refuse to retreat." By early August, 11,000 American troops moved through mountain passes toward Mexico City, the largest city on the continent. Santa Anna set up defenses on the most obvious routes leading to the city, but Lee led troops through difficult terrain to avoid them. At Contreras, Mexican General Gabriel Valencia did not follow American orders to surrender, leading to a defeat. Santa Anna then set up defenses at a monastery on the Churubusco River. Both sides fought fiercely there. Already thinking that they were defeated, Santa Anna chose not to resupply his soldiers. The San Patricios, a Mexican battalion mostly made up of Irish-American deserters, fought bravely, knowing capture likely meant death. In the end, American forces captured 85 of them, while 65 died, and about 100 escaped. Scott then learned that the Mexican army was melting church bells into cannons at Molino del Rey. On September 8th, he launched a surprise raid, but Santa Anna's troops were ready. The raid turned into a battle, and nearly 800 Americans died, only to find no weapons there after all. It was a costly victory with little gain. Nearby, the Chapultepec Castle overlooked Mexico City. This fort and military academy protected the capital's southwest. Scott decided to capture it. On September 12th, he ordered heavy artillery fire, followed by a full assault the next day. Despite a small Mexican garrison inside, the academy's young cadets bravely joined the fight. 6 cadets, now immortalized as the Niños Heroes in Mexico, died defending the castle. After a tough assault, the Americans finally raised their flag over Chapultepec. Scott's troops then pushed through and took the city's gates. By September 14th, Mexico City surrendered. That morning, the U.S. flag flew over the city. U.S. Marines secured the National Palace, where Scott later stayed. While Mexico City's wealthy residents accepted U.S. control, the poor citizens fought back with sticks and stones before being subdued. The U.S. held the city for 9 months, reopening businesses, but often clashing culturally. Some soldiers respected local customs and religion, while others detested them. After failing to relieve the city, Santa Anna resigned his presidency and went into exile. The United States had won the war. The Mexican War, Part 3. To annex or not to annex. When President Polk started the war in 1846, he was supported by his fellow pro-war Democrats in the House of Representatives. But by the time General Scott entered Mexico City, the anti-war Whigs had taken control. In December 1847, the new Whig-controlled Congress gathered. Polk defended the war, arguing that Mexico started it by attacking American soldiers on U.S. soil. He claimed that Mexico owed the U.S. an indemnity, and that getting Mexican land was the best way to settle this debt. The Whigs disagreed, saying Mexico was not the aggressor. A new Whig congressman from Illinois, Abraham Lincoln, argued that the first bloodshed of the war took place on land recognized as Mexican territory by the Adams-Onis Treaty, and the people there did not consider themselves American. Many Whigs believed that America should not take any territory from Mexico at all. As for the Democrats, some wanted to annex all of Mexico as part of Manifest Destiny, but others, like John C. Calhoun, strongly disliked this idea. To incorporate Mexico, Calhoun argued, would be the first departure of the kind, for more than half of its population are pure Indians, and by far the larger portion of the residue mixed blood. I protest against the incorporation of such a people. Ours is the government of the white man. According to Calhoun, the Rio Grande would make for a much better border. While Scott was occupying Mexico City, Nicholas Trist was busy negotiating in it. Polk sent Trist to Mexico to negotiate a peace treaty and gain Mexican land, including California and New Mexico. Trist, who spoke Spanish and had diplomatic experience, kept the mission quiet to avoid public backlash. Meanwhile, Polk grew more ambitious. He believed that, since the U.S. crushed the Mexicans battle after battle, the U.S. should get even more land. Polk suggested moving the U.S. border as far south as Tampico and getting land across the Isthmus of Tehuantepec for a future canal. He ordered Trist to return, but Trist ignored this order, believing that suddenly ending negotiations would throw an unstable Mexico into chaos. He stayed and worked towards a peace deal. On February 2, 1848, he succeeded and signed a treaty. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo ended the Mexican-American War. Mexico gave up nearly half of its land to the U.S., including what is now California, Nevada, Arizona, Utah, New Mexico, and Texas, along with parts of Wyoming, Colorado, Kansas, and Oklahoma. In exchange, the U.S. paid Mexico $15 million and assumed just over $3 million worth of Mexican debt. Although these terms were hard on Mexico, Trist thought the treaty would stop more fighting and bring peace. When Trist sent the treaty to Washington, Polk was angry that Trist had disobeyed his orders to leave Mexico. However, Polk accepted the treaty since it secured as much land as he could realistically get. The Senate approved it on March 10, 1848. Many in the U.S. celebrated, but some Mexican leaders felt deeply humiliated. Despite some wanting to keep fighting, Mexico was too drained from war to continue, so they accepted the treaty, and U.S. troops left in June. One veteran of the war, Ulysses S. Grant, will later reflect that the Mexican War was one of the most unjust wars ever waged by a stronger against a weaker nation. It was an instance of a republic following the bad example of European monarchies. Part 6. Prophets and Argonauts. Almost 30 years before the end of the war with Mexico, a young man named Joseph Smith claimed to see Jesus Christ in a vision. Jesus warned him that he would soon return and was unhappy that people had turned away from faith. Smith said these visions led him to create the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, later known as the Mormons. He believed people were in the latter days before Jesus' return and urged them to prepare. Smith came from a poor farming family in Vermont that moved to New York. In 1823, he claimed an angel named Moroni appeared to him, guiding him to a set of golden plates buried in the ground. Smith said he translated these plates with help from a scribe, creating the Book of Mormon in 1830. This book told of ancient Israelites who came to the Americas and split into two groups, the God-fearing Nephites and the Lamanites who rejected their beliefs. Over time, they fought until the Lamanites vanquished the Nephites. Moroni, the last Nephite, recorded and buried their history, which he later showed to Smith. The Mormon faith began during the Second Great Awakening, a period of intense religious growth in the U.S. Smith gained followers quickly, but faced hostility. He led his followers west, settling first in Ohio, then in Missouri. Many locals resented the Mormons for their beliefs and practices. Tensions grew, leading to violence and the Mormon War of 1838, which ended with the Missouri governor ordering Mormons to leave and Smith imprisoned. In 1839, Smith escaped jail and led his followers to Illinois, where they built the town of Nauvoo, meaning beautiful place. The Mormons grew their community and, at first, were welcomed because they helped the local economy. But as Smith gained power, becoming mayor, military leader, and judge of the town, relations strained. Nauvoo became one of Illinois' largest cities, and Smith's influence upset locals, especially when he involved the Mormons in politics. In 1844, he announced he was running for president, which made people even more suspicious of his ambitions. When a dissident Mormon newspaper accused Smith of practicing polygamy, he shut it down, angering non-Mormons. Soon after, a mob arrested him, and while he was in jail, a group of anti-Mormons broke in and killed him and his brother Hiram. Brigham Young then took over. Aware that the Mormons were not accepted in the East, he led the Mormons west. By 1847, he guided them to the Great Salt Lake Valley, where they built an isolated community. They created the state of Deseret, covering much of today's Utah, Nevada, and Arizona, and Young set up a theocratic government to keep church control strong. But Congress limited their land to just Utah and made it a territory instead of a state, sparking conflict between Young and federal officials. President James Buchanan eventually sent troops to Utah to prevent rebellion. The Utah War ended peacefully, though incidents like the Mountain Meadows Massacre, where over 100 non-Mormon settlers heading to California were butchered, increased anti-Mormon sentiment. Young stayed influential until his death in 1877, after which the U.S. government pushed harder to end polygamy and align Utah with federal laws. While Nicholas Trist was working on a peace deal with Mexico, James Marshall discovered gold in the American River in California near Sacramento. Jenny Wimmer, a cook at Marshall's work site, tested it and confirmed it was gold on January 24, 1848. By May, word reached San Francisco, causing people to abandon the town and head to the river to prospect. The news reached farther, and by December 5th, President Polk publicly announced the discovery, sparking the California Gold Rush. People from Oregon, Mexico, Peru, Chile, and as far away as Hawaii and China, as well as thousands across the U.S., rushed to California. To reach the gold fields, Americans traveled by sea around South America, through Central America, or overland, which was cheaper but slower. This spurred the development of fast clipper ships for faster sea travel, and renewed interest in building a canal across Central America to reduce travel time. California's population quickly grew, reaching around 93,000 in 1850 and over 223,000 by 1852. Although most gold seekers were men, some women came too, working as cooks or laundresses, where they could earn good money. Oftentimes, people deserted their jobs or military posts to join the fray. The gold rush had harsh impacts on local and indigenous people, however. Migrants brought diseases, disrupted buffalo herds, and fought for land. Many indigenous people were displaced or killed. Between 1845 and 1855, California's indigenous population fell from 150,000 to just a third of that number. The booming settler population brought rapid change. California became a diverse and unique cosmopolitan society, leading Congress to make it the 31st state in 1850. Gold rushes in other areas throughout the 1850s and 1860s helped regions like Colorado, Nevada, Idaho, and Montana to develop quickly and move towards statehood as well. The last episode of expansion in the contiguous United States came in 1854. The United States wanted a southern railroad route to the Pacific. This required land in the Mesilla Valley of Arizona, still owned by Mexico under the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. The U.S. government sent James Gadsden to buy about 29,000 square miles of desert south of the Gila River for $10 million. Santa Anna, who had recently once again become Mexico's president, agreed to the sale without much hassle. As America's diplomats and generals were purchasing and conquering land, its politicians argued over what should happen with this land. For years, America was splitting into two sides, those against slavery, mainly in the North, and those supporting it, mainly in the South. One major argument was whether or not slavery should be allowed in new states. Though temporary fixes were applied, these only delayed the problem. To keep a balance of power, Congress tried to have an equal number of free states, where slavery was illegal, and slave states, where it was allowed. A major issue was maintaining this balance of power. With new territories becoming available after the Mexican War, the southern states saw it as a chance to expand slavery, potentially giving them more influence in government. In 1846, David Wilmot proposed a law to ban slavery in any land gained from Mexico, but Congress rejected it. Regardless, this proposal influenced future debates. For example, when California applied to join the U.S. as a free state, the Compromise of 1850 allowed it, but it also allowed people in future states like Arizona and New Mexico to decide on slavery for themselves. The issue of slavery in new territories added more tension to an already divided nation. As one New England philosopher prophesied, "The United States will conquer Mexico, but it will be as a man who swallows the arsenic which brings him down in return. Mexico will poison us."